Welcome, everyone. I'm going to give the official welcome to our March Learning Community event featuring Cris Stainbrook from Indian Land Tenure Foundation and Ikram Muhammad, who will be doing our interfaith text study tonight. We're so excited to have you all here. My name is Sarah Paterka. I'm the Director of Opportunity St. Paul at Interfaith Action, and I also work with our congregational engagement. So we are excited that you are here tonight to learn together, to be in community together. And as we gather, we'll continue to let folks in. I'm going to ask that you remain on mute and utilize that chat box to say hello and to ask your questions. Cris and I will moderate a Q&A at the end of his presentation. So feel free to use that chat box to ask your questions throughout the presentation. He is also sharing a PowerPoint tonight, so he will use a screen share during his time as well. But first, I have the honor and privilege to introduce to you my Executive Director of Interfaith Action, Randy Ross, to give a quick couple words of welcome and introduce our speakers. So Randy, take it over.
Thank you, Sarah. It's great to see everybody. I'm so excited that our speakers are here. And I want to start by saying this. Interfaith Action believes that opportunity grows and poverty recedes when people of faith invest themselves in effective action. All of our volunteers here are engaged in important work in community that helps to boost our neighbors' stability and economic mobility. To build community among us, the network of volunteers, and to deepen our understanding of the barriers our community members face, we have learning community together one night each month. Thank you for joining us tonight in what promises to be a fabulous learning session. Last month, we studied with Shirley Sherrod and Stephen Carpenter to learn about the issues faced by African-American farmers. You might have asked before last month's session, what rural justice issues have to do with racial justice in the cities? But we saw last month, the answer is everything. In the context of African-American farmers, we learned about the roots of the civil rights movement in the Deep South and in farming communities. And we learned about how the ways that systemic discrimination plays out in the city, for example, through mortgage redlining, those ways are mirrored in the devices of systemic discrimination in the world of farming. In tonight's eye-opening session, we're going to learn about land issues in the American Indian community. It's my great privilege and great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Cris Stainbrook. Cris, a Lakota, is the president of the Indian Land Tenure Foundation, which provides grants and services to Indian nations and individual Indian people. ILTF, or Indian Land Tenure Foundation, focuses on recovering land within reservation boundaries and off-reservation sacred sites to Indian land ownership and management. Cris is also the chairman of the Indian Land Capital Company, a for-profit community development financial institution subsidiary of the Indian Land Tenure Foundation and the Native American Community Development Corporation. Cris has worked throughout Indian country and on Indian land issues for more than 30 years. He also has an extensive background in philanthropy, having served as senior program officer and program director at Northwest Area Foundation and as a board member of the Grotto Foundation, the St. Paul Foundation, and the Minnesota Community Foundation. Cris has served on the boards of the ACLU Minnesota and of the Native Governance Center. Cris and his wife operate Heath Glen Farm and Kitchen in Forest Lake. Welcome, Cris.
Gee, thank you. Hiani Washte, Yapai, Cris Stainbrook, Amachiapi. Hello and welcome. Randy, thanks for the plug for Heath Glen, by the way. I'll tell Dorothy who sent that along. We're selling lots of things by internet sales these days, as you might imagine. So it's my pleasure to be here, and tonight I want to run through a little history on Indian land just to give you some context of where a lot of anxieties in Indian country come from, and where just to no small sense, it's where some of the antagonism that we feel in Indian country arises from, and that becomes it becomes a very personal thing when you get down to talking about people's families' land and issues surrounding that, and it grows from there. Let me get this screen share up, and we should be good to go. Let me do this, and this should be on. There we go. So this is the mission. So you know where I'm coming from. This is the mission of the Indian Land Tenure Foundation. We were created in 2002 and as a venture community for Northwest Area Foundation. But we're interested in, that's fascinating. Our mission is to recover all of the land inside reservation boundaries, the original reservation boundaries, and those areas outside that still hold a cultural and historical significance for the tribes, and return all of that to Indian ownership, management, and control. We work on not only recapturing the land that's been alienated, but also, and this may sound a little harsh, we work on wresting the management and ownership away from the federal government as well. But it may sound harsh, but as the years go by, I get harsher and harsher. We have 4 strategies that we pursue, education being one of the major strategies. Probably 70% of our work over the last 18 years has been around education, not just education of Indian people, but education of non-Indian people as well, so that folks can understand how Indian land got in the situation it's in. Economic opportunities, we believe land really holds the economic opportunities for the tribes and for Indian, how this thing keeps going. But for Indian people as well, in terms of jobs and employment. Cultural awareness, when we first started, the question was, what are we going to do in culture? And one of the gentlemen who was on the steering committee, that thing just keeps wanting to go, said Indian people have been so disconnected for so long from the land that they've forgotten their culture that's tied to the land. And so we need to rediscover that. You're gonna have to, I beg your pardon with the slides. Legal reform, we do all kinds of legal reform, from legislation to lawsuits and amicus briefs, and getting the system to be a reformed system. This, of course, was Indian land before the Europeans' arrival and Columbus' arrival. It was the entirety of the continent of about 800 separate and distinct tribes. Today we have 574 federally recognized tribes, and somewhere between 30 and 40 state recognized tribes. Now I'm going the wrong way. Of course, as the colonists came, they came on the East Coast and began to push Indian people to the West, or make agreements to live together of some sort. And at first, most of it was living together, and then eventually became more the push to the West. And in fact, in the 1830s, we had Andrew Jackson as the president, and he, of course, signed the Indian Removal Act, which essentially extinguished land claims by the tribes in the east and moved them all to Oklahoma Territory, which was then known as Indian Country. Resulted in the Trail of Tears, not just for the Cherokees, but for a good many tribes from the east. Some of the tribes coming out of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Ohio had some of the most arduous journey, and many more died of their tribe as the march continued. And then, of course, we have the gold rush to the east or to the west coast, California and Oregon. You can see that they refer to the Great Plains and other places as flyover country these days. In those days, it was more like just ride your wagon over the country and get to the other side. And that push kept going. Along about then and into the 1800s, we had the concept of manifest destiny. And so the Europeans really saw it as this was land to be tamed, and it was up to them to get out and tame it. And you can see this was a picture done by a German artist, and you've got your basic angelic figure stringing the telegraph wire. You've got all the sod busters down on the bottom there. You've got the railroad coming in. And of course, you've got the buffalo running in fear and Indian people running in fear and that bear making his last stand. But I put this in not so much for the historical purposes, but to say to you, this is still the mindset that we struggle against. And if you have been asleep for the last 4 years with the Department of Interior, with an oil and gas lobbyist as at the head of it, you missed the part that said manifest destiny written all over it, because that's exactly what's still going on today, with people looking at land as, especially in the West, as not being tamed in a European sense, not being tamed, and being open and vast and can handle all the exploration you could possibly do. So this then became what is known as Indian country, and this is a very, I would say, kind of graphic description that's not terribly accurate, in the sense that it appears that these red blocks are all solid red blocks, and all the land inside of those are Indian-owned lands, and it's just not the case, and I'll explain why in a few minutes. The one thing I will say is I've got to change this picture. I was doing a presentation to a family who owned large tracts of land at Crow in northern Cheyenne, and I looked at the map to show them where that's at. Crow and northern Cheyenne reservations aren't on this map. Now they lay that off on me being Oglala and still carrying a grudge against the Crow for fighting with Custer at the Little Bighorn. I told them, no, that's not the case, but they weren't convinced, let me say that. So the land loss prior to 1887, Indian people and the tribes had reserved 138 million acres of land. And if you read the treaties, virtually every treaty says for the exclusive use of Indian people and the tribe, with the exception of a couple acres for the school marm, a couple acres for the blacksmith, and a couple acres for the agency. And, small tracts of land, but reserved for the pieces that were to fulfill the responsibility of the tribes. The reason we use 1887 as the marker on this is that in 1881, the federal government quit doing treaties with tribes. And in 1887, they passed the Dawes General Allotment Act. And the General Allotment Act remained generally in effect until 1934. And what it did was it divided the tribal community land into individual owned Indian land. And so each head of household on 150 of the reservations, each head of household received 160 acres of land as an allotment. In some cases, they went to 320 acres. In other cases, they went to 80 acres. What happened in doing that were a couple of very significant things. So for one, they declared all Indian people and tribes incompetent to handle their own affairs and took the land's title into trust by the federal government. And in doing that, they became the trustee and Indian people became the beneficiaries. So they had the beneficial use of, but not the title to that land. The other piece they did with this is after they did their allotments for every head of household, they then declared all the remaining land on any given reservation as in excess of Indian needs and essentially paid pennies on the dollar to the tribe and took those acres and then put those acres up for sale to mining companies, timber companies, the railroads, and other businesses. And what they didn't sell that way, they then opened to homesteading on the reservations. And by 1934, when all of that was stopped, that then became, that was the Indian Reorganization Act, which said allotment will stop. The 90 million acres that were lost, 38 million acres were ceded to the federal government. Now, ceded typically in Indian country means those acres that were given up to reserve the reservation area. But the federal government says they were ceded to the federal, these acres were also ceded to the federal government, even though there was no agreement around some of that. 22 million acres of homesteading occurred between 1987 and 1934, and 30 million acres were lost through other means. And the other means included illegal takings, included sales by the individual Indian people, included some loss through inheritance, and any number of ways people could get Indian land. This was Teddy Roosevelt's inaugural address in 1901, where he made this statement: the General Allotment Act is the mighty pulverizing engine to break up the tribal mass. And that's what it was all about. It was trying to put the tribes out of business, essentially, make Indian people not citizens by any means, not citizens of the US. That didn't happen until 1924. But it made them individuals that they could then deal as individuals with Indian people. So how does this work? I'll show you an example with the Salish Kootenai tribe in northwest, what is now northwest Montana. After the 1855 Hell's Gate Treaty, this was the reservation, and the green is tribal land. So the entirety of it was tribal land. They then did the allotments until about 1909, and the yellow small blocks are the individual allotments. And the Salish tribe, who were from the area, you can see pretty much down the valley there, the Flathead Valley. The outside of the reservation boundaries is all mountain peaks. And then up on the left-hand side are the Kootenai families. Then their families stretched all the way into eastern Washington. And so they go back and forth all the time, but some of them had allotments on Flathead. And you can see they're concentrated largely around the waterways. So then the rest was declared in excess of Indian needs, and homesteading occurred, and the state came in and picked up some lands. And this is the pattern you have today on the Flathead Reservation. A couple of things I'll point out about this. One, you see the purple dot down at toward the bottom there. That's the National Bison Range. And so the Salish Kootenai people in the late 1800s saw that people were shooting all of the buffalo and killing them. And so they took a herd and marched it up to Canada and held it up there in Canada for, geez, I don't know, almost, I suppose, 70 or 80 years. No, not quite that long, about 60 years they held it up there. And then Teddy Roosevelt decided that we needed a place to still see some buffalo. And so he decided to take part of the reservation and turn it into the National Bison Range. And the tribe brought the buffalo back down. Interestingly, the federal government managed the bison range for years. And about 20 years ago, the tribe said, it's our land, there are buffalo, and we're going to manage the bison range. And 2 years ago, they finally got full management of the bison range. They were fought by both federal workers who wanted to keep their jobs there, as well as conservation groups who said that the tribes would just shoot and eat the buffalo. After protecting them for 80 years, it seemed unlikely they were going to shoot and eat them. The other thing I would point out on here is another kind of hot spot for us, and that's you can see the individual small kind of purplish areas down here. Excuse me. You can see these areas that are sections. And so section 16 and 36 of each township is reserved for school lands. And this occurred when the states became states. They had this authorization that every 16 and 36 would be supporting schools and through income. And that was the early days of, statehood. Well, those lands amount to a fair bit of land now. And if any of you went to the University of Minnesota, you benefited from Indian land in that every section in Minnesota was producing revenue to the University of Minnesota and other land grant schools, as well as some non-land grant schools also get money from the school lands. And that still amounts to a tremendous amount of land across the country. And in some cases on reservations where the reservation existed before the state, this is considered an illegal taking. Quickly, let's run through Minnesota because I want to get to the conversations about where the anxieties really come from. So the Ojibwe were mostly in the northern part of the state. They were getting pushed from the east, and the Dakotas were primarily in the west and southwest of Minnesota. And you can see this right about here is where Minneapolis is. And you can see that's kind of close to the dividing line. This dividing line, if you're interested, the Ojibwe and the Dakota had wars for years over where that dividing line was at. It wasn't anything new to have conflict in the area. Here are the land cessions in the state. You can see when the reservations were established and some of the areas that were agreed to be ceded to the state and the federal government. At this point, I would like to put in a plug for a website that we have that you can get to through our website, and it's called the Treaty Signers Project. And a gentleman by the name of Marty Case put together histories on the treaty signers. He started with the non-Indian treaty signers and learned of their story, and one story grew to another story. And you can go on the website and see these stories. There's probably about 300 different treaties have stories in there. There's something like 1,800 signers. But basically, most people in the country would tell you that the treaties were between the tribes and the federal government. And in reality, they were commercial transactions largely between the treaty signers and the tribes. And every good treaty signer had his connection in Congress so that they could get these ratified and signed. The gentleman who made about $9 million in 2 days with the Kentucky Derby a couple of years ago, he's from the family who owned all of Tennessee and Kentucky at one point, and they got that all through one treaty that their uncles and brothers and stepsons and others all signed. This was common. It was common in Minnesota, and that's why you'll see Ramsey's name on it, and you'll see Sibley and others who signed these treaties that were ratified later by Congress. Very quickly, I'm going to run through these. This is Net Lake. It's got 3 components to it. You've got the main part of the reservation at Net Lake, and then Deer Creek and down at Vermilion. This is the ownership pattern today. Actually, this is in the process of changing by about 16,000 acres that the tribe is, that the Conservation Fund originally has settled an agreement with Potlatch on, and then the Conservation Fund has agreed to sell the land on the reservation, inside the reservation boundaries to the tribe. So some of the pink on here, the corporate lands, will be going back over to the tribe over a period of time. And the foundation is helping them arrange the financing on that. You can see the forfeited lands. I talked earlier about lands we lost through various means. Many of the forfeited lands came from when Indian people, as they were declared incompetent, in 1906, a commission was put together, went out to the reservations and looked for competent Indians. And if they could find competent Indians, they would transfer their land from trust to fee status, as any other person would own land in a fee status under county jurisdiction. What happened though, and there were a good many ways to kind of separate Indian people from their land at that point, but one of the most used one was tax forfeiture. So an Indian woman could marry an Indian man or a white man and be declared competent. Indian man marrying a white woman couldn't be declared competent because women at that time were pretty much chattel, just like Indian people, right? So the only way an Indian man could be declared competent was to join the military. And when they would join the military, their land would get converted from trust to fee, but they're in the military and never got notice that that occurred. And the taxes would start accruing on that property, and they would end up being sold on the courthouse steps, basically. And so you can see some large blocks here of forfeited land, and that's land that, in essence, people were waiting for it to come up and be essentially tax forfeiture. You can see on the Net Lake portion a few private inholdings on the reservation, but the band is really interested in getting more of the pink done. Leech Lake happens to be our poster child for what was wrong with the Allotment Act. This is the Leech Lake Reservation, and the thing you can see is the federal government owns the majority of land on the reservation. It's because when they took it as in excess for Indian needs, no one else really wanted it. They didn't recognize the importance of timber at the time and stuff. And so no one would bid on it and no one would homestead it. And so the federal government retained its ownership, and today that's part of the national forest. They have done some trading, and considerable amount of trading, as well as the school lands, and you can see the blue are the state lands inside the reservation. And that's the second largest landowner on Leech Lake. So if you're driving down whatever it is up there, Highway 12, going east to west, you come across a sign that says you're entering the Leech Lake Reservation. You drive for another, I don't know, hour over past Walker, and you'll see another sign that says leaving the Leech Lake Reservation. And if you don't know the history behind it, you think, wow, they own a lot of land. and then when you see this picture, you realize how little they own. In fact, they own about 4% of that land. Some of you may even have holdings on Leech Lake. So there are a number of people from the Twin Cities who own some of these small lots along Leech Lake for their cabins. These are generally leased properties to people with cabins. And the state of Minnesota leases property to cabin owners as well. Some of you may remember 2 years ago, 3 years ago, the state started putting some of these leases up for auction, and the landowners or the cabin owners it really raised a ruckus about the whole thing because they had their cabins on there and wanted to make sure their lease stayed in place. Interestingly enough, when we first started the foundation, we made a trip to Leech Lake and they took us on a little boat ride around. They were showing us the ones that they had leased out, and the BIA had done an assessment and appraisal of what those properties should be worth. And they were told it should be $13,000 a year for a lease. And the tribe said, well, we're only going to charge $1,300 because we want to be good neighbors. And I said, well, these are the folks who are suing you. This is a county who is suing the tribe. I mean, they don't want to be good neighbors. You know, what's the deal? But they stuck with it. This just gives you a better picture of how little land they own. It's the red dots on here. This too is changing. We got Congress to relinquish about 16,000 acres to the tribe as a partial settlement for what are called secretarial transfers. They're illegal transfers by the Secretary of Interior that occurred back in the early 1900s. White Earth is a different picture. This is where all the Indian people in Minnesota were supposed to go. They were all supposed to be removed to the White Earth Reservation. And you can see the red lands are Minnesota Chippewa tribe lands. And so the band doesn't own these, all the bands do. They've been working to divvy up both the land as well as proceeds from it among all the Chippewa bands. There are only 34 remaining allotments on White Earth. You can see some of the dark green places are where the band has their lands, and it's very small in acreage size. Mille Lacs, same deal. Only a lot more private land on the Mille Lacs reservation. To hear the squawk that went on over the fishing rights, you would have thought that this reservation was encompassing the entirety of Mille Lacs. It's a very small reservation, and the state park makes up a great deal of it. And you can see there's only a small amount of trust land here, a little bit over here, and the rest of this is fee land that pays county taxes. This is kind of a quick summary, and it's a dated piece, and I have to explain the dated piece. So you can see at the top, you've got the reservations, the treaty, the acreage that was on the original reservation, the individual Indians in 1935 when the allotments were done. And then you've got land owned by the tribe and by individuals in 2002. The reason we can't put up other numbers is that's the last year the Bureau of Indian Affairs really consolidated their numbers by reservation in a coherent manner. And we have spent 3 years with interns building a database of actual land ownership, but we can't share that unless we have every tribe's permission. It was our agreement with them that we would hold it in confidence unless we ask them specifically for it. There have been some changes on here. Leech Lake is one. They are now at, with their new addition of the 16,000 acres, they'll be just under 5% of ownership on the reservation, on the original reservation. Red Lake, you can see, is at 100%. They were not allotted. The 7 chiefs up there, when they heard the government was coming to approach them about allotment, just disappeared. And that was the end of the discussion. They came back, they said we aren't going to do that. The government came back again and they all disappeared again. It was a little bit like the Wisconsin legislature a few years ago when they just disappear now and then. It was the early mode. The other thing that this chart shows you is the Shakopee, well, the 4 Dakota reservations. those were all executive order establishment. And so they were after the Allotment Act took place, but not after the Nelson Act, which affected Minnesota, took place. And their reservations have been growing because under the executive order, there's a provision for allowing additions to the reservations. But you can still see these are very small compared to most reservations in the country. Tribal land losses, 51 million acres were owned prior to the treaties. That dropped to 2.1 million on the reserves. And so you're at about 4% of the original land mass. After the Nelson Act, it was down to 1.4. And today it's about 980,000 acres, approximately 2% of the Minnesota 51 million acres. I have to tell you, this still remains, and it remains really heavy in Minnesota as well as some of the other states. It's the free and open access to land, water, and resources is fundamental to the culture and life of Indian people. The reason it's important, especially in the Midwest, is you don't have as much federal land as you have in other states. And the federal lands are considered open and unclaimed areas, and tribes can pursue treaty rights on those open and unclaimed areas. In the Midwest, because that's more limited, it's difficult for the tribes to practice their culture. These are our homelands. I mean, it's like, you know, if someone came to you and said, we're taking over your house and stuff, and you can go live over here for a while. But, you know, you have 151 tribes represented in Minnesota. They're from all over the country. They're from Canada. They're from Alaska. They're everywhere. And if you're sitting and talking with a number of Indian people and you say, where are you from? They're likely not to tell you, you know, South Minneapolis or St. Paul. They're going to tell you, well, my family's from White Earth, or my family's from Grand Portage, or and they have a tie there. It's, for many of them, they're actually landowners, and we'll talk a little more about that. Our religious beliefs are directly tied to land and natural resources. You know, non-Indians tend to take for granted that they have religious freedom, and have had religious freedom for a couple hundred years in this country. It wasn't until 1974 that the Indian Religious Freedom Act was passed. And up to that point, things like the Sundance were prohibited and people could be jailed. We had a number of places where religious beliefs were just they weren't abandoned, but they had to go underground in order to be practiced. And that's, it's a difficult thing when that happens, but people stuck with it, and I'm glad they did. Again, substance and sustenance, those come from the land. And then there's the economics. We just finished a project with a place called Village Earth, an organization with Colorado State University. And our interest was in what do we lose in the ag economy to this alienation of property on the reservations. Right now, we're losing about $1 billion a year that could be going into the Indian economy, but is flowing straight out of it and gone. We hope to recapture that. This is, so I gave a talk similar to this one night, and the next day I was in the office, and we have an artist that does work for us every once in a while when he's not in the big house. And he came by and said, you know, I just got out and I could really use some work. And he goes, is there anything I can do for you? And he and I happened to be standing up by one of the books on the coffee table that was open to the Manifest Destiny. And I said, this is what I want. I want the reverse of Manifest Destiny, because that's our goal. And so Chuck went to work and he had our version of an angelic figure rolling up the telegraph lines and the buffalo running back, and you get a picture of the river on fire in the background and the pipelines running through our land. And I said, you know, Chuck, the bear's kind of back there a ways. He doesn't look quite so bold. And he said he's tired of being shot at, so he's hiding behind these guys. I thought it was a great picture he did for us. In fact, we've been selling T-shirts with it on there. Here's why we do this. This is why we do this. I think it's going to play. Yeah, maybe it's not going to play. I guess it's not. So the other thing we have going on at the foundation is our genetics program. No, I'm kidding you. This is a picture of, this is how I feel after I blaze through that much history so quickly. I showed that at University of Wisconsin, and this professor came up afterwards and says, you know, that's the most disturbing thing I ever saw, but I can't take my eyes off of it. One thing I would like to share with you, where we get our most anxiety in Indian country right now, and it comes from the allotment process. As incompetent people, we weren't able to make wills. And so the federal government set up a process for distributing the land to heirs. But they didn't distribute the land because it's held in trust. And so they distributed parts of the title. So over time, you had people inheriting part of the title, not part of the land. And after that started in what, 1890. And so after 7 or 8 generations, you have literally hundreds of thousands of people owning parts of the land. In fact, we have about 2.5 million land ownership interests in less than 10 million acres of land. And the average is about 12 ownership interests per allotment now. That's the average. And the individuals own, well, one woman who's 45 years old owns 340 different individual interests in, I think, 9 different reservations. And it's become this quagmire where working on trying to do leases, trying to do right-of-ways, trying to even use your land requires 51% approval from all the land ownership. And so if you can imagine putting yourself in a place where you have a family gathering, let's say a big dinner, and you're going to talk at that big dinner about how you're going to lease your land for the next 5 years with 2,000 of your closest relatives. Most people can't even name 20 of their closest relatives, let alone 100, let alone 2,000. And I'm not exaggerating this when I say 2,000. We have the example of an allotment at Lakota Ray in Wisconsin that has almost 5,900 owners. And it's an 80-acre allotment. It gets timbered once every 60 years. So there's not much land coming, or not much money coming off of that for Indian people. And then there's the flip side of that, where any small interest is an Indian person's tie to home. And as long as they own that small interest, that's home for them. And they won't give it up. They won't sell it. They don't ever intend to sell it. And the federal government has tried to, through a probate code, attempted to force sales along the way. And you have people being very anxiety-ridden and hostile about that. So under the Cabell case, there was a settlement to put together a land buyback program. And to their I give the people who run that great credit, in that they put it together well, but it gives me pause when I see things like at Pine Ridge. I guess they did 130 million dollars worth of sales on Pine Ridge. And I happened to be out there a month later, and you couldn't buy a gun or ammunition in Rapid City. And I talked to the guy in Shields, because I thought I'd go do some prairie dog hunting. I talked to the guy in Shields Hardware, and he said, if you want to buy some ammunition, you need to go to Pine Ridge. They bought it all. And it's a level of anxiety in Indian country right now that it's worrisome to me. And so with that, I'll let you go to the questions if you want.
Thanks, Chris. That sounds great. I appreciate your PowerPoint. That was in depth and wonderful. A lot of history in that short time. You walked us through a ton. I'm going to throw it to Randy. She and I have been kind of chatting on the side. She had a couple good questions. One was about the Cobell case, which she just brought up as well. So I'll let her pick one of her questions first.
Sure. And right after I ask one, we'll throw to Florence to ask the question she put in the chat, just to cue you up. Chris and I worked together many years ago. And when Chris first explained to me that American Indians were deemed incompetent to own land, I thought he was trying to see if he could get me to buy it. I was like, I could not believe it, and came to know about it through the Cobell case and a lot of other work. And Chris, I wonder if you could explain a little bit more about Cobell and the Indian trust system, because it's just kind of unbelievable unless you hear it from someone you respect. And let us know whether that presumption that Indians are deemed incompetent to own land is still in effect in America.
Oh, it's, yeah, it is still in effect. In fact, one of our staff members went to put trust into land, and the state of South Dakota said they did not think that the fee land should be in trust because the person worked at Indian Land Tenure Foundation. So clearly they were competent to know what they were doing. And the federal government has a form that you fill out that explains why you need them to take the land into trust, which basically means, how are you incompetent to do this? And the reason you have to understand, the reason Indian people want it in trust is because then it's under the tribal government, and it becomes the only way to put it under tribal jurisdiction, as well as not pay taxes to the county on it. So land that's in trust that generates revenue doesn't go directly to Indian people. So it goes to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, who then collects it and sends it to the Department of the Treasury. And Treasury then takes it and divides it up according to the land ownership interests. And they place it in what's called an individual Indian money account. And they hold that account until it gets to a certain amount, and then they'll cut a check and send it to Indian people. So I'm sure many of you have heard over the years, oh, every Indian gets a government check. Well, they cut them and send them all at the same time, and it's their money coming back to them from the lease on their land. But the people assumed they were just getting some kind of welfare or something. Eloise Cobell, who was a banker at Blackfeet, sued the federal government for mismanagement of those individual Indian money accounts, and said, as trustee, you need to be able to show us the money in and the money out. And when they did the first run at it, $146 billion was missing. And so the lawsuit proceeded for 16 years. They finally came to a settlement. Congress tried to step in a couple of times and nix the whole deal, but they ended up with a settlement of $3.1 billion. About half of it went directly to the interest holders. and the other half went to the federal government for the land buyback program to cut down the number of undivided interests that were being created. You have to understand that we've been trying to get them to allow us to help write wills, and it costs the federal government $160 per year to administer every one of these individual land interests. And with 2 million of them, you know that they don't have that in the budget. And that's why they're headed for another part of another lawsuit that way, because they just don't put the money into it to do it right. It's, in fact, the chief judge from the Office of Hearings and Appeals, the probate for Indian lands, who we had lunch one time a year ago, and he said, you can't imagine the number of Cabell-sized lawsuits that they're just laying in wait out there for another go. On the other hand, Eloise was good at raising funds and paid a team of attorneys for 16 years of work, because it was fought at every level. In fact, at one point, the federal government had the judge removed from the case because they thought he was being harsh when he said that they were the most incompetent department he'd ever run across. And he's recognized as one of the best judges on the bench, Royce Lambert.
Thanks, Chris. Florence, would you like to ask your question?
Okay. You mentioned at the beginning that the goal of your foundation was to get back all of the land that should originally belong to the reservations. And I wondered what your primary strategies are for doing this.
Well, we know it's going to have to be largely willing seller, willing buyer. And so our goal really is to help the tribes think through what lands they want, where are their priorities in terms of their reservation and getting it back. And then raising funds. We have a subsidiary, the Indian Land Capital Company, which is a for-profit subsidiary that lends to the tribes on full faith and credit for land purchases. And so far, I think we've recovered, I think we're right under 100,000. In fact, we'll cross 100,000 acres in probably the next 3 months. So it's, most of it's gonna come that way. There's not a lot of big lawsuits hanging out there that are gonna happen. There's, most of the reservations have been settled with in terms of bad surveys and other pieces like that. There are a few places where we'll go back and pursue it against the federal government. Leech Lake being one of those where they had illegal takings. I think you'll see, and we help the tribes buy land in the Black Hills, but the tribes really want the Black Hills back, the Lakota tribes. But most of it's willing seller, willing buyer. I would say one other thing. We spend 60% of our time fending off more land loss. And especially with the new probate code, we're looking at what's called the third generation cliff. So if you get out far enough and you're away from tribal membership or eligible to be enrolled, they can put your land up for sale at probate. And we're getting lots of families in that situation right now. And so we're trying to fend off that loss.
Awesome. Thank you, Florence, and thank you, Chris, for asking that question. Oh, we've got one from Kay. She says, I've had conversation with families and organizations that recognize that they own stolen land and would like to give it back. Where do they start in researching if that is an option?
They can call me and I can probably put them in touch with who they need to talk to. Now, you know, one thing we get offers sometimes on land that it's too far away from where the tribe is at the time. And so we're very clear with folks that sometimes the tribes may not want it simply because they can't manage it and can't handle it. And if it comes in, they may end up selling it. And so it's, I mean, we're right up front with folks so that no one questions, are they getting the full story? But most tribes are quite willing to at least consider it if it's anywhere close to them.
Awesome, thank you. I got two coming in here. Could you comment on the legal development in Oklahoma with a larger definition, the smile says something, larger definition of tribal land per treaty now under federal jurisdiction instead of state, county, and municipal jurisdiction?
Well, the Oklahoma case kind of turned Indian country on its head. And for one, we didn't expect it from the Supreme Court. I mean, we only had one other case heard by the court from the tribes in the last 15 years and have had no success. And then out of the blue, the big one comes home. So, I mean, it was a ruling that said that there was no disestablishment of the reservation. That in essence, it was just an ignoring of the reservation. And so the case was found, Gorsuch wrote the opinion, and he wrote it in a way that showed more understanding of Indian law than we've seen on the court for years and years and years. And so the court decision gives the jurisdiction back to the tribe, and the question then becomes, all right, there's all these people living there. It's all been, you know, presumed to be Oklahoma state jurisdiction. And now they've got to work out the arrangements between the tribes and the state. But it puts the tribe in an equal footing discussion, as opposed to having to kowtow to the state on it. And so it's going to take some number of years to get it worked out. But conservatively, we've had 30 or 40 calls from tribes asking us if they would qualify for something like that. And, you know, we had, in fact, all of the Minnesota tribes called us at one point. And it doesn't appear that you're going to see that type of situation in most of the other tribes. There are a few, but they're mostly Pueblos, and there's a couple in New York that have a good basis for that.
Awesome, thank you for that. I've got 3 questions. We're getting close on time, but I'm going to keep going because they're good questions. What do you know about President Biden's pick for Secretary of Interior, and do you see her making strides in native land reparations?
Yeah, I know her. She was she was with one of the Pueblos when we had a grant to them, and so I met her when she was the general manager at the Pueblo. It's like, and I'll say this to you, I said it the other day on Native America Calling Radio. We all, in Indian country, we all have our wish list, right? And so here's this Indian woman who got appointed, or could more than likely get appointed to be the Secretary of Interior. And she's going to get a wish list from everyone. In fact, I've already sent mine, and I helped make 2 more, and you get to a point, and so she's going to be inundated with that. And I said on the radio the other day, I think we all need to step back and see what her wish list is and what she thinks she can accomplish in 4 years, and then in the next 4 years after that. But in Indian country, we tend to be, we have all this pent up energy and wanting things done, and the fear is that if she doesn't get everybody's wish list completed in the first 6 months, we're going to just say, oh, she's a bust. You know? And And it'd be completely unfair because she's working with, Interior was gutted by the last administration. I was back there in December before the shutdown, and I was on the secretary's floor for a meeting, and there were only 2 out of maybe 150 offices that had anyone in it. I mean, it's completely gutted. And she's going to have to come in and start rebuilding a lot of that. The Bureau of Indian Affairs itself has almost been non-existent in Indian country. Now, part of that's the virus, but a lot of it's, just the lack of attention from the secretary.
Sounds like we're going to have to give her support and patience.
Yes.
Yeah. So this is a question I think that's on a lot of our thoughts and minds and hearts right now. And Jill asked it, and she says, how can I, as a person of faith who has no direct ties that she knows of to any tribes in Minnesota or across the country, help to advocate for our brothers and sisters who are tribal members?
A lot of it's being informed. When you're in a conversation, being able to talk from a basis of some information to people. When we first started the foundation, our staff said, well, we ought to go out there and, really beat on the drum and stuff. And I said, if we could just get people to a point where they didn't fight us, if they would just let us do our work and go down this path without fighting us on it, we'd be so far ahead of where we are now. And I think having, when I was getting ready for this, I was going down through the list of all the presentations I've given. I've probably done 400 or 500 of these presentations just to get people to understand how we got in the situation we got and where we would like to go. And we aren't beating up on people. We just want to get to that point where we get what was promised. The treaties promised these lands for exclusive use and occupation. And we would be happy to get back to that point and not have the hostilities that we see. And the other day I was talking to a woman from the Rural Initiatives Association or a membership organization, and she was telling me how racism has really gone down in rural America and we should all get together. I thought she was trying to provoke me. So I said to her, have you ever been to a border town? She said, well, no. And now she's been drawing these people into this conversation saying, I was asked this question the other day if I'd ever been to a border town, and I had no good answer. I said, well, you need to understand that what you see if you're just driving through rural America, and she's out of Tennessee, I said, that's not the West. It's not even the Midwest. We have Hobart, the village of Hobart, inside the reservation boundaries of Oneida, who just got done having another settlement against Hobart. But it's like the 6th time they've sued the tribe for petty stuff. And you go, why are you doing that? You're on reservation land. If we could just get some of that sorted out where people could have a conversation, we'd all be better off. But I think in the end, the best thing you can do in terms of supporting people is getting informed and understanding where people are at.
Thank you so much, Cris. I'm going to email a couple more questions to you, and if you can let me know the answers, I'll get back to our guests here. But thank you so much. It was a wonderful presentation, and we all did learn a great deal. And as people who are on other people's land, we need to learn and advocate and walk alongside all of our brothers and sisters, no matter who they are. And so I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
You're welcome.